what do you think it means to be included?
Hello everyone, my name is Emily. If you don't know me, I'm an intern this year at Front Porch, and tonight we are continuing our series called The Politics of the Divine. And our basis for that is to explore the contrasts between the structures and systems that exist within our culture and society and the countercultural way of being that Jesus presented in his life and teachings. So out of discussions on these topics, I formulated a question that we're going to base our time around tonight and our discussion on Saturday. And that is, how do our perceptions of gender, both politically and theologically, influence our belief systems, how we carry those out, as well as our own self-concepts and self-discoveries? And we're keeping that in mind. I'm mostly going to talk about the use of feminine pronouns in reference to God or God figures. And this is something that is relatively new to me, so if it's new to you, I'm right there with you. But it has been something very beautiful and that has exposed a lot of my internalized beliefs. So I'm really excited for our discussion time on Saturday. To open us, I'm going to read from this lovely book, Untamed by Glennon, Doyle, and it's something that a group of us in the Front Porch community are reading currently this quarter together, and just finding time to discuss that. So she addresses this topic a little bit in the book as well. And how she frames this is a reader of hers has written in and asked her a question about it. So the reader says, "Glennon, you refer to God as she. Why do you believe that God's a female?" And Glennon replies, "I don't. I think it's ridiculous to think of God as anything that could possibly be gendered. But as long as the expression of God as female is unimaginable to many, while the expression of God as male feels perfectly acceptable, and as long as women continue to be undervalued and abused and controlled here on earth, I'll keep using it." So I thought that language and that description was just so beautifully concise. And to reiterate that for you all watching this, I am not trying to argue that God is a woman or a female in the sense that we might characterize that. But if the use of feminine pronouns for God feels uncomfortable or threatening to certain beliefs that we hold, I think it definitely deserves some more reflections on how we have viewed women, how we view women, and why that belief might need a little tweaking. So, again, I don't think God is a female or a male. I think we have created those binaries to help us in some ways, but I think I'm just suggesting that viewing God in a broader sense outside of our gender binary could be helpful. So, a little bit on my own experience with this idea. Growing up in the Christian tradition, I was taught to view God as a father or king or Lord, all of which carry a very overt masculine tone. However, I was taught a lot of feminine traits of God, loving and kind and merciful and nurturing and generous. But those feminine traits then had to fit back into this masculine identity of God. And this didn't really trouble me at all. It was just something that I reconciled on my own. But it did make me a little more hesitant to put my own feminine traits to use within the context of my church. So I worked for the course of a school year in the church I grew up in. I was an intern for our middle school youth group when I was a senior in high school. And I loved working there. I knew that I was valued as a team member and a staff member and a contributor, but I did feel a little split where a lot of my more masculine traits, my drive or my ambition or my decisiveness were really valued and really encouraged. And then in other ways, my intuition, my empathy, my sensitivity weren't discouraged, but they definitely were not as valued or appreciated in that context, which prompted me to think about our views of women in the church a little bit more. And during this time, and over the course of the next few years, I still considered God to hold the same feminine traits that I had seen in myself, intuitive and full of empathy, sensitive to pain and depth of emotion, but I don't think that time I would have been very ready to accept a feminine incarnation or feminine pronouns for God or God as mother. And I think only recently in my journey of divinity and politics even was I ready for a God figure who holds space outside of that binary concept. And I think that's a common experience for many people I've talked to, that we need some time to adjust to this language because it's so, we're so steeped in it from such a young age. So it really has only been recently that this way of thinking and this way of speaking has felt more comfortable for me. So if that's you right now, stick with us. We're getting somewhere. And even in the Hebrew Bible, I began to realize that there's several, if not many, mentions of God in a more feminine way. There is metaphors of God birthing the nation of Israel and nursing the nation of Israel. In Numbers 11:12, it says, "Did I conceive all this people? Did I give birth to them, that you should say to me, carry them in your bosom as a nurse carries a suckling child to the land that you promised an oath to their ancestors?" We see it in Isaiah 66:13. "As a mother comforts her child, so I will comfort you. You shall be comforted in Jerusalem." And then another example of the birth metaphor from Deuteronomy 32:18. "You were unmindful of the rock that bore you. You forgot the God who gave you birth." So we see all this feminine language, and it wasn't that I had never heard that. I just was never taught to really value that or think much about it. And these things were held in tension instead of accepted as a God beyond our views of gender. And we see feminine language as well in reference to the Spirit of God. In Hebrew, the verb to hover is conjugated as grammatically feminine. And the act of hovering has the connotation of a mother bird feeding her babies. Rakaf is used in the Deuteronomy verse to describe the way God cares for the Israelites in the desert. And the same verb is in Genesis 1. The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And I think those little intricacies in language and in definition have been really helpful for me in realizing that the feminine God is not left out of the Hebrew tradition or the scriptures. It's just not something that I had ever heard of. So I think we can recognize, obviously, that God has female characteristics and female traits that we associate with ourselves, and that really we are all a mix of both feminine and masculine traits and qualities. So where does that take us? What does it mean for us? Why does all of this matter? I think we can go back to what Glennon Doyle says, that it highlights a lot of inequality within our gender hierarchies. But we can also use this language of God as she and her to further self-reflection and discovery, as Father Richard Rohr suggests in his book and his reflections in the Universal Christ. He says, I know I'm taking some risks writing about feminine incarnation. There are certainly limitations to the construct of binary genders. God and Christ are beyond gender, and all humans are a blend of masculine and feminine traits. But because Western Christianity and culture have primarily worshipped male images, I believe it's important to reclaim and honor female wisdom. So if I can take a second to be honest with you all, piecing together and remembering this feminine God was a deeply healing and emotional process, as I think it should be. It required me to truly reflect on my own internalized misogyny, my view of women in the church, my view of God that had been so overtly masculine until relatively recently, and unearthing those beliefs, some of which I know have caused pain to myself and others, is confusing and disorienting at best. So, like I began with, I'm not arguing that God or the incarnation or the forces in our midst are female. I'm simply suggesting that if you find it uncomfortable, threatening, or silly to refer to God as she, reflect on those feelings and how maybe they are less about how we see God and more about how we see ourselves and the women around us. And additionally, if referring to God with masculine pronouns has brought about pain, mistrust, or a lack of connection with the divine, know that you can use other words and you can use other pronouns. So maybe reflect on what that would be like for you. I'm going to end our time with a beautiful quote by Dr. Reverend Jackie Lewis in a piece that she calls She is God, She is Love. And she talks a little bit about God is not immune to our projections and to our sort of conjecture, because if God is this divine being that we connect to, of course we're going to put some characteristics or some identities onto it or she that need a little bit of reflection, need a little bit of analyzing. So she says, of course, because God is a mystery, we don't know anything about her. So out of our imaginations and our yearnings, our hopes and our fears, we make stuff up. At our best, we project goodness, power, kindness, and love onto God. At our worst, we create a God who is punitive, angry, judgmental, and harsh. We do this because we are those things, and we think they make us safe. I know I've got my projections. They're inspired by my imagination and by textual studies. In Hebrew, the words for womb and mercy have the same root, and the word for spirit is feminine. In Greek, the word pneuma has a feminine article. The word Sophia stands for wisdom, and the word agape, God's love for us, is also a feminine word. Therefore, my God is an incarnate feminine power who smells like vanilla and is full of sass and truth, delivered with kindness. She'll do anything for her creation. Her love is fierce. She weeps when we do and insists on justice. She is God. She is love. So this week and in the coming weeks, let's invite God in all her sweetness, mystery, intuition, and peace. And let her remind us of those things that are inherent in us all, whether cisgender, non-binary, gender fluid, intersex, genderqueer. I believe we will live in a way that is more true and more beautiful when we stop trying to keep God as small as we are, and we let God be free in all of her expression. See you on Saturday.